You're listening to Blood in Bohemia, a Czechast special series.
I'm Vít Pohanka.
And I'm Rob Cameron.
Two journalists cutting through the murky thickets of Czech history, where murder and power have long walked hand in hand.
Let's step into the shadow.
So, Rob, today we need to say something very clearly right at the start. What we are dealing with today is not a proven historical event, it is a myth. And yet, I think it is a myth soaked in blood, because even though the Maidens War, which is what we will talk about, probably never happened as a real war between men and women, the story is full of killing, betrayal, executions and brutal revenge. And myths like this matter because they tell us how societies explained violence, power and order to themselves. So today's episode is about a bloody myth and why it became one of the most powerful stories in Czech history.
Okay, but can I also say something right at the beginning? I think it's the right moment to admit that I know absolutely nothing about the Maidens War. Zero, with the exception of one thing that I perhaps one time when I have heard it before. But you have kids, right? You have a daughter, I believe.
That's right. She's 18.
Okay, as do I. And so the one time that I've heard the phrase Maidens War or Divčí války, I think.
Divčí válka, yeah.
Divčí válka is when my daughter, a few years ago at her primary school, there was some dispute in her class with other girls, and I happened to mention it to the teacher, and she said, "No, jo, Divčí válka," no, like Maidens War. Is that said does that mean the same thing in Czech? If you say Divčí válka, does it somehow refer back to this episode in
I'm
Czech?
I'm pretty sure,
legend?
Rob, that everyone would in Czechia would know what it is referring to, and it's kind of part of common knowledge, even though people perhaps never read, the Staré pověsti české, the ancient Czech myths, which is a book that we will talk about. Even people just with very kind of superficial knowledge of history will know what Divčí válka, the Maidens War, is about, or what it is referring to, that it's referring to usually young women or girls even being united against men.
So when our teacher said it, there was perhaps a reference to that. It's not just a general phrase for girls and boys fighting in class.
It's definitely a reference to that.
Okay,
because there's no other Divčí válka, Maidens War, other than the myth, that we will be talking about.
Okay,
yes.
well, let's get back to that myth. So how did it make its way into, serious Czech historiography?
Well, the story actually entered Czech history in the early 12th century in the Chronicle of Cosmas of Prague, the oldest Czech chronicle. It's called Chronica Bohemorum. It was written in Latin. And even Cosmas, when he wrote it, he probably knew that he was writing about a legend, not fact. But let's listen to how violent that legend already is.
In those days, the maidens of this land grew up without any yoke upon them, like Amazons. They longed for weapons of war, chose their own leaders, and practiced the arts of battle, just as the young men did.
Right, well, that already sounds, like a myth, but also like a confrontation that was waiting to happen.
Exactly, and confrontation that turns into bloodshed, actually, because Cosmas describes fighting, deception, and finally a massacre during a truce. There was a kind of betrayal when armed men attack unarmed women during a feast.
The young men fell upon the feasting maidens like hungry wolves entering a sheepfold.
So this is where blood enters the story, not as history, but as kind of moral warning, I think, without much detail. So, because the story that we know about today, the myth, is kind of much longer than how it is described by Cosmas, I spoke to a proper historian, medievalist, Eva Doležalová, a friend of Blood in Bohemia, I'm kind of glad to say. And I asked her to put Cosmas himself as the first written source of the Maidens story into a proper historical context.
Cosmas described this tale as a myth from early Czech history. These are events that took place in ancient pre-Christian times, and Cosmas links the Maidens War to the legend of Libuše, the ruler who married Přemysl the plowman. According to mythical tradition, it was from this union that the Přemysl dynasty originated. According to Cosmas, at that time, girls and women lived freely, hunting in the forests, choosing their own partners, and dressing like men. They allegedly built a castle opposite the duke's residence and named it Jevín. The women's and girls' independence allegedly provoked the men and boys, and so war broke out. As there were no winners, the men and women eventually agreed to a ceasefire and a 3-day feast. However, after the first day, the men broke the truce, armed themselves with the agreed signal, and attacked the women. Each man reportedly kidnapped one of those women. Since then, women have been under the power of men.
So, Cosmas explains that the bloodshed serves a purpose, to explain why order must replace chaos and why male rule must replace female independence.
Although you wonder why there was any need to do that in a presumably hierarchical, male-dominated society at the time that Cosmas was writing.
I suppose it's... I mean, that would be my speculation, I have to say, but I would assume that it's a kind of sign of insecurity.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah, I definitely do. Because the story didn't disappear with Cosmas. I mean, it reappeared again in later chronicles, and they didn't calm the story down. So Eva Doležalová actually gives us a brief survey of how other chroniclers, later chroniclers, treated it.
It reappeared in Czech chronicles at the beginning of the 14th century, this time in the form of a Czech verse chronicle written by a man whose name is known as Dalimil. It was at this time that Vlasta, the leader of the women, also appeared in the story. This wild, bloody tale was taken up and faithfully rewritten in the 16th century by Václav Hájek of Libočany. It was he who created Czech national mythology. Unlike Cosmas, Hájek names all the heroes in the story. The leader of the women is Vlasta, who fights against the brave knight Šťasoň, the lucky man. However, the main protagonist is the young knight Ctirat, who is a loyal advisor to Duke Přemysl the plowman. Ctirat is lured into a trap by Šárka, a beautiful member of Vlasta's retinue, and subsequently killed by the women. In revenge, the men declare war, resulting in the death of Vlasta and other women.
I think what is worth noticing is that we've got some more names, that enter the story. We already have the story of Šárka and Ctirat, and let me mention that's a kind of indication how deeply it went into kind of public, I would say, subconsciousness here in Prague, or public urban maybe myths or stories, because we have Šárecké údolí. Have you ever been there?
I have indeed, yeah. It's near Divoká Šárka. Also the word Šárka.
Exactly, and wild Šárka, yeah? I mean, it's called Divoká Šárka. Probably that's how people started calling it in the 19th century. And we also have Jevín, which means literally a maiden's castle.
But that's outside Bratislava, isn't it?
That's a different one.
It's a different Jevín.
We've got one here in Prague, which is actually opposite on the opposite side of the Vltava River to Vyšehrad.
Really?
Maidens castle.
That's called Jevín?
Yeah.
And it's here in
Jevín
Prague
as well. Well, it is it is supposed to be the place where the Jevín was actually situated. And to add to that, I mean, there are really ruins of some kind of fortification there. So we don't know whether it's directly kind of connected with the Maidens War, but there are ruins there. So in people's minds, it must be that famous Jevín.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting.
So that's very interesting.
Right, well, I obviously don't know much about, or didn't know much about Jevín or the origins of these places in Prague. But what I do know, I suppose, is that in the 19th century and Czech, romantic nationalists, they played a really important role in forming the narrative of your nation's history, right? So how did Czech historians and Czech writers deal with this story, the Maidens War? Did they treat it as fact? Did they treat it as pure legend, or was it a story that may have happened and they embellished it?
Well, both, actually, I would say. But first, let's have a look at the real authority, which is František Palacký. And he was a true historian. I mean, he was he was not a romantic historian, and he wrote the first kind of authoritative history of Czech nation in Bohemia and Moravia. And he actually was quite skeptical. He expressed serious doubts. So let's listen to him.
The strangest of the ancient Czech legends concerns the so-called Maidens War, that is, a conspiracy and revolt of the female sex against the male in Bohemia. It is difficult to decide whether this legend rests upon any historical foundation at all. It seems, however, more likely that the mere name of the ruined Děvín, that is, the Maiden's Castle, itself furnished the fertile imagination of our nation with the first material for the tale, which our earliest chronicler Cosmas touched upon only briefly and in vague terms, while later writers, in the manner of romancers, endeavoured to embellish it with a multitude of new details.
So, in other words, even at the height of Czech nationalism, when the Czech national story was being told and retold, there was some skepticism.
There definitely was, but skepticism, as you will probably know, Rob, doesn't compete well with dramatic, bloodshed, with dramatic stories. And there was definitely a kind of part of that movement, of national revivalist movement, that was relying quite heavily on the romantic ideas and that were trying to popularize the Czech history using any means possible. And about 2 decades after František Palacký died, actually, comes Alois Jirásek, the man who actually managed to fix the Maidens War, really, in the Czech imagination.
So it's still in the 19th century, sorry.
Still the 19th century, but we are talking about the year 1893, when the work Ancient Bohemian Legends by Alois Jirásek was published for the first time. It became a huge hit, a bestseller, and it's been the bestseller for at least the first part of the 20th century as well. I actually asked my kids, but they don't read it at school anymore, I'm afraid. But we still had to read it, even under communism, And it's a very romantic version of the ancient Bohemian legends. And one of the legends is, of course, the Maidens War. And this is how Alois Jirásek opens the Maidens War chapter, not cautiously, but immediately with anger, I think, turning directly into violence.
At last the hidden anger burst out like a sudden flame. Driven by desire for power and revenge, the maidens took up sword and bow and, without weighing their strength, began a hard war against all men. Leading them all was Vlasta, once foremost among Libuše's companions.
So right from the very outset, this isn't, metaphorical violence. This is an outright declaration of war.
Yes, and Jirásek makes sure the listener, or the reader rather, understands just how real and how bloody that war is meant to be. There's no skepticism actually in that book if you really read that. Let's listen to it.
Hail of their arrows fell on the men like a sudden snowstorm. There was no more laughing then. They were bloodied and fell, not here and there, but in lines. 300 bleeding men lay dead on the ground.
Right, so that's really, mass slaughter, isn't it? It's not some sort of gentrified skirmish between men and women, is it?
Definitely not. You're right, Rob. And I think the most famous and memorable episode of the Maidens War, according to Alois Jirásek, is the trap laid for the warrior Ctirad by Šárka, I mentioned a moment before. And again, Jirásek, and I think that's noteworthy since this is Blood in Bohemia, Jirásek in his version doesn't spare the blood.
Before Ctirat's men could leap to their feet, the fighters were upon them, striking and stabbing. His men remained on the clearing in trampled grass soaked with blood. They lay in the sun, stabbed and dead.
And striking and stabbing, his men remained on the clearing, trampled grass soaked with blood. They lay in the sun, stabbed and dead.
So that gruesome image then, blood in the grass, bodies left in the sun, that's really the kind of scene that presumably young schoolboy Vít Bohanka and all young Czechs really don't forget too quickly.
I was even wondering, whether some schools might consider the real Jirásek's version maybe even inappropriate.
Even inappropriate for kids of that age.
For little kids. But anyway, the story ends the only way the 19th century mythology allows it to end, with total and merciless revenge. Because finally, actually, the men get themselves organized and attack Děvín, that's the maiden castle that we talked about, which according to the urban myth is on the other side of the river from the real Vyšehrad castle. And Vlasta, as a true Amazon, leads her troops to the battle with a man on her horse. Unfortunately, she gets too far ahead. She's so eager to fight that she finds herself alone, fighting among the superior number of men. And here is a last quote of Jirásek's version of the story.
They closed in on her, dragged her from her horse and cut her to pieces with their knives. When they had wiped out that whole army of women, they burned Děvín to ashes and scattered its remains.
So basically, there's a skirmish when the women attack the men, and then what happens afterwards is a sort of an overwhelming act of revenge by the men against the women. There's no reconciliation at all. There's just blood, punishment, and destruction.
Exactly. And Jirásek even ends the story as if to stress that when he writes that when they had wiped out the whole army of women, they burned Děvín, their castle, the Maidens' castle, to ashes and scattered its remains. It's like, they wouldn't even want to use that castle because it was somehow tarnished, by it wasn't clean, because the women were there, and so they needed to scatter it to all sides, and they wouldn't leave a stone, on a stone, as we say in Czech.
Leave a stone unturned, and I think that brings us to the question of why this latest and perhaps bloodiest version of the myth has stuck in the general public understanding of the story. Now, I think the message is clear. Women, you stay in your place, and it's the men who will always emerge on top. But what is the reasons behind that? Why do you think this version has remained in the public consciousness here in this country?
That's where I would like to bring Eva Doležalová, the proper historian, into the discussion again.
Alois Jirásek was a Czech history teacher and author of many historical novels that accurately reflected the state of knowledge about Czech history at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. However, Jirásek was also an exceptionally skilled storyteller who knew how to construct dramatic narratives. One of his books is Old Czech Legends. These stories were collected from various chronicles and narratives, combining fact with fiction perfectly. It is these stories that have shaped the modern Czech concept of mythology. His retelling of the story of women in war also belongs in this category. Jirásek firmly relies on Hayek's account. However, neither Hayek nor Jirásek wrote these stories as a historical fact, but rather as stories inspired by history and mythology. Readers have simply forgotten this. They have forgotten where to look for real information and facts.
So Jurasek, he wasn't trying to deceive anyone. He wasn't presenting this as history. He was writing stories.
He was writing stories based on history. He was writing historical novels with some facts. And I mean, to be fair, he wrote, for example, about the Hussite Wars. And there's a lot of truth, you know. He mentions the battles that really took place. And I suppose it's the mixture of facts and fiction in his work that makes it so fascinating. But of course, I mean, people, as Eva Doležalová said, people forget, you know, to distinguish what really happened and what didn't happen.
And of course, Jurasek and historians and authors before him are writing about events that were said maybe to have taken place 1,000 years previously. We shouldn't forget that as well.
Exactly, but I think over time the distinction disappeared, as Eva Doležalová seems to indicate, or maybe rather confirm. What was meant as a powerful narrative slowly hardened into what people think happened. So bloodshed in a story, in a fiction, starts to feel like bloodshed in history. And I think that raises quite an interesting question. If the Maidens War doesn't reflect historical reality, what was the real position of women in medieval Bohemia? And whom else to ask, of course, than Eva Doležalová?
This is a very, very difficult question. We only have a few reliable sources. Nevertheless, we can say that women's position was not strictly determined by men's superiority. Although women were seen as dependent on their fathers and husbands, the idea of their complete subordination to men is more associated with the modern era. Recall that at the beginning of the story there is a Duchess Libuše, a ruler. Moving from mythology to history, we must mention Duchesses Ludmila and Drahomíra, who ruled as regents for a long time and whose status was never questioned. There are more such cases in the Czech Middle Ages. They were actually subordinated, but they were able to combat for their rights and their position.
So, in other words, women in medieval Bohemia, they were subordinate to men, obviously, but they were far from invisible or powerless, and sometimes they did actually hold positions of authority.
Exactly, and as Eva Doležalová mentioned, Drahomíra and Ludmila, the two women that we talked about when we recorded the episode about Saint Wenceslas.
And these are real women.
And these were definitely real women.
They weren't myths.
And they were powerful women, you know. So it's not so kind of black and white. But if you want to have a good story and good moral, probably you have to make it. You have to turn it into something like Jurasek did. So it kind of simplifies a complex reality into a very violent moral story that he wanted to present.
But or rather was Bohemia and this myth about violent warrior women, is that something special and unique to Bohemia, or is this, as has been so many times in the past, Czech myth creators and authors and storytellers using the same kind of historical narratives and the same stories that were used across Europe at the time?
I don't know whether across Europe, but definitely the image of armed, independent women already existed long before even Cosmas, the chronicler, and are not unique to the Czech mythology, even if they are not perhaps, you know, going across, and they are not, I don't know if they are in Italian mythology or Spanish mythology or etc., but they are definitely present in other stories.
So stories about independent and combative women have their roots in ancient Greece, where tales of a matriarchal society have been preserved. These were women who knew how to fight and prefer girls to boys from an early age. These Amazons, as ancient authors called them, fascinated people, and stories about them passed from antiquity into medieval chronicles and later literary works. They are also a frequent subject in Renaissance and Baroque paintings. Stories about independent female warriors have fascinated readers for centuries. But these are not just stories. In even in Czech history, there are documented moments when women came to the fore, fighting proudly alongside men who accepted them as equals. One such episode occurred at the beginning of the Hussite War, when women clearly stood at the forefront. It was women who saved Commander John Žižka with their heroic fighting in the Battle of Vítkov, while the men were absent.
So Cosmas and the others, they were borrowing a ready-made myth that does have its roots, as Eva says there, in antiquity. But there are obviously in Czech history examples of women, including in medieval history, who did fight and did play a role in real battles that we knew took place.
Right, and as I mentioned, I think a few minutes before, Jirásek was writing about the Hussites, yeah, and let's mention the Battle of Vítkov, in which the Hussites had their first big victory here just outside of Prague, actually on a small hill, not far from here where we are sitting now. And that's what Eva was talking about. I mean, there were definitely women who came to aid of Jan Žižka, this famous Czech warrior. So, you know, there were definitely women fighting like true Czech lionesses, and that's a fact, you know. So we have to bear that in mind as well in this context, I think.
That's fascinating. So in other words, real women fight in historical battles, and history largely forgets them, but fictional women fighting battles, and this story becomes eternal.
Exactly. And I think it's because myths don't preserve reality. They preserve meaning, you know, and warning. I mean, it's not so much about, it's not always about the facts, what really happened. It's about the meaning and what people think that happened. And here, Eva Doležalová, gives an answer to the question, why did Cosmas even include the Maidens War at all, if he knew that it wasn't perhaps a literal history?
It's like moving from a dramatic story to a grey reality. There are several theories how about to interpret Maidens War. The first suggests that it is a literary motif used by medieval authors to emphasize the role and position of women in the society. A more likely second theory refers to the ancient myth of the Amazons, which the chronicle Cosmas knew and adapted to Czech history. And third theory suggests that Cosmas described a pre-Christian ritual involving the symbolic and physical marriage of the land and the plowmen, as well as boys and girls, to welcome spring. The entire battle would then have been just one part of this celebration. However, there is another version, the fourth, I believe. With a great deal of exaggeration and irony, we can accept the story of the Maidens' War as true. Ultimately, everyone must decide for themselves.
So, in other words, the Maidens' War does have perhaps elements in it that you could take with a touch of irony. It could be a symbolic story, but I suppose those things don't really survive being repeated endlessly, do they? What survives is the violence and the blood and a very clear binary ending that the men destroyed the women.
Yes, Rob, and it gave me an idea. Doesn't the kind of very dramatic, bloodthirsty, and according to at least some views, a very sexist story, when you look at it from today's point of view, tell us more about how people like even Alois Jirásek, who kind of took this story and made it much larger and mythical and, presented it to people, that, it shows, I think, what Alois Jirásek viewed, or what he thought rather, about the world and its order. And that's what I finally asked Eva again.
So you are completely right to point out that Jirásek's stories about Czech history reveal more about 19th century life than about the Middle Ages. Much of it is based on our ancestors' romanticized ideas of what life looked like in the Middle Ages. Even today, most people will describe the Middle Ages as a dark period that preceded the modern era of progress, in the words of Francesco Petrarca, for example. But Petrarca was actually talking about the Renaissance. But returning to your question, the story of Maidens War illustrates how people's perceptions of societal development were stereotypical. The authors needed the story to end with contemporary social order, to emphasize the wildness and chaos of the old days. Only when good male rulers came along did the world become orderly. Unfortunately, this view was not only held in the 19th and 20th century, but also by our contemporaries.
But crucially, we should say, wrapping up, the Maidens War, it probably never happened.
Almost certainly not. But the blood in the story definitely mattered.
Because it explained who should rule whom, who should obey whom, and what happens when that order is challenged.
Yeah, no matter what we might think about it today in the 21st century, but that's definitely why this myth survived and why I think it belongs in Blood in Bohemia.
Because sometimes, I guess, the most powerful bloodshed happens not on the battlefield, but in the stories that shape how societies think.
Thanks for listening to Blood in Bohemia, a Czechast special series.
With Vít Pohanka
and Rob Cameron.
And if you enjoyed today's episode, please follow or subscribe wherever you listen and share it with a friend.
It helps us reach more people and bring you more stories from the darker corners of Czech history.
On Czechast.